Ottoman Empire, and he came back with a book that was called 1,000 Nights and a Night, and he thought, what a great book. I'm going to translate it into French. And by translate, I mean rewrite it into French, because, you know, it's primitive folk tales, and sophisticated money-having consumers want a fancier folk tale. So he writes the book that we now know as the Arabian Nights. He's the guy who gives it the name, the Arabian Nights. And some of the nights come from a manuscript of Syrian tales that he had. You can see in libraries now, we think. We're not 1,000,000% sure it's the same manuscript, it's a different story. But some of them are known as orphan tales, which probably does not mean Golan made them entirely up, but does mean he collected them from storytellers in Turkey, or storytellers in Egypt, or storytellers in different parts of the East when he was traveling around, and then he would remember those stories. Whether or not he took notes at the time, we do not know, but he would remember the stories and he would write them down and add them to his cool Arabian Nights, because he wants to make it 1,000 nights so that you know, he makes word count. An impulse known to all of us. And among the stories that he adds in the orphan stories is a story called The Tale of Sidi Numan, which is about a man who marries a ghoul, as Dan mentioned. And it is a very similar to sort of French fairy tales in that you marry a fairy or a swan maid or a werewolf or whatever, and she says, don't look in my bedroom, don't watch me bathe, don't follow me when I leave the house. In this case, the ghoul, whose name is Amina, only eats rice 1 grain at a time at meals. And she says, oh, it's just, I'm very delicate. I'm a beautiful feminine flower. I can't be gorging myself like a man. And don't follow me when I leave the house. And Sidi Numan, a suspicious fellow, follows her when she leaves the house. And sure enough, she goes back to a graveyard with her ghoul babies and eats corpses, and that's why she's always full and can only bear to eat rice when she's with Sidi Numan, and that's a horrible, startling revelation. And that's the end of the story, basically. Golan's ghouls, I don't want to say they take Europe by storm, but they begin to sort of filter into dictionaries of Islam. People start mentioning ghouls. Other sorts of stories use the word ghoul. They don't usually center on ghouls. And then a fellow named William Beckford writes a Gothic novel called Vathek, which is about a historical caliph named Vathek, who did none of the things that Beckford says. Basically, the caliph has so much power that he says, I'm bored, I'm going to summon Iblis, the devil, and he's going to give me cool stuff to do. And among the cool stuff that he does is he has little adventures with ghouls, and Beckford makes sure to mention their sort of charnel nature. And helpfully, he writes it in French. The guy who translates it against his will into English is a guy named Samuel Henley, who puts in a lot of notes. And among the notes to Beckford's Vathek is, for example, Al-Azif, the sound of insects at night, often ascribed to demons. And Lovecraft has read that entry, as we all know. And one of his other entries is helpfully explaining ghouls. It says, ghouls are ogres that work in waste places. They lure you off the road and eat you. Sometimes they can take the form of beautiful women, and everyone's like, okay, I got it. And they also, if they can't get travelers, they'll go to the graveyard and eat all the dead bodies. And that's where Beckford's ghoul enters, and I believe one of the Henley notes later, or one of the bits of poetry in the novel, discusses the ghoul and uses the word something like wolf-like scalp to describe the ghoul. So that's the first of the Lovecraftian dog head motifs that comes in. There's a fellow named Alfred North Whitehead who writes a terrific short story called Amina, which is basically a retelling in modern dress of the Tale of Sidi Numan. And of course, Clark Ashton Smith wrote a terrific ghoul story, in addition to the Grinning Ghoul, which is a different ghoul story, called, no, Grinning Ghoul's black, different ghoul story. But The Nameless Offspring, which is about a man who has basically traveled to the East and contracted a perhaps unwise marriage. And the offspring of that marriage is trapped beneath the house. And of course, the people who come to visit the man picked the bad day, and the ghoulish offspring gets out and runs away, and that's the end. But you can see even as late as Clark Ashton Smith's early writing, we have still the ghoul seen as a Persian monster or Whitehead story takes place in Persia, or a monster that is imported from the east to the west, a la Dracula. Dracula is scary not just because he's a vampire, but because he's a foreigner. He's from Transylvania. We can't have people like that, marrying English people. That would be wrong. So the otherization, the orientalization, the exoticization of the ghoul is very much part of that ghoul story. And again, it shows up even post-Lovecraft. L. Ron Hubbard writes a ghoul story in which the ghoul is also a genie who transforms. And that does, in fact, go back to Mesopotamian folklore, or rather, Bedouin folklore. So that ghoul would seem to have been the unbreakable model of the ghoul forever, that it's just another exotic monster, until H.P. Lovecraft changed it up. And to go with that, we have Will Murray to talk about Lovecraft's ghoul.
Lovecraft, when he was very young, went through what we could call his Arabian period, where he read The Thousand and One Nights and fell in love with the culture as he perceived it. And of course, that's where he probably came first in contact with the concept of the ghoul. And during that time, he named himself fancifully Abdul al-Hazred, which doesn't translate at all, but he didn't know that at the time. So he had this immersion in Middle Eastern cultures as they were transmitted through the books being described. I don't know when he read that, but I assume it was much later.
Yeah, it was, I think it was in the 20s.
Yeah, I would think so. So when he starts to write more seriously, he gets out of his juvenilia 100 years ago, approximately, this time, 1920, 1923. He starts to bring the ghoul into his stories. And first he does it sort of by the back door. We all know that Pickman's Mark is probably his big ghoul story. But before that, a year or two before that, he writes The Outsider, a very Poe-esque story about a narrator who stumbles out of some underground catacomb in an unknown place that, certainly from the style of writing, you would think it would be England or Europe. And he finds a castle and people, and he steps in and he tries to introduce himself, and he flees in terror. And he doesn't know who he is. How he got there. He's been alive a long time. He's lived underground. Now he's above ground. And when he encounters a mirror, he sees why he fled. He's essentially a corpse, or seems to be a corpse. However, the story at the end veers very sharply in another direction. And if I have that page at hand, he basically starts talking about now he rides the winds with the ghouls in what is obviously Egypt. So I guess maybe he's a monk. I don't know, but it's never described. And that's the first time Lovecraft uses ghouls in his fiction. And it's only a few years later that he writes Dickens' Model, in which, I don't want to recapitulate the entire story. I assume just a read it once. And so he may have decided to remember that. But it's about a painter named Hickman who lives in the north end of Boston. And he's a painter of unusual subjects, and a lot of the subjects are creatures who feed and avoid graveyards. And the narrator ultimately discovers that Pickman is not what he seems. He's what Lovecraft sort of presents as a ghoul changeling, someone outwardly human but has ghoul qualities. Lovecraft's ghouls are a little bit like the Vathek ghouls, in that they have a canine aspect, but they're rubbery like the night dogs that used to haunt, Lovecraft's nightmares, more or less during or around the time of his Arabian period. They're slumpy, slouchy creatures. They feed upon the corpses, and it's implied in the story that either kidnap babies and transform them or train them into ghouls, or they swap them. Actually, I don't remember.
kind of both are
Yeah,
important.
it's unclear. So Lovecraft is taking, as he often did with mythological creatures, he's abstracted them from their original, locality, or transporting it to Egypt in one story, to North End of Boston in another story, and making it his own, giving it a canine aspect to the face, and making them these creatures who can only be seen in graveyards, can only feed upon the dead, and live underground, like the outsider, but the outsider is the ghoul, because maybe because he's just somehow related to the ghouls, or becomes friendly with the ghouls, because they're all food creatures, so it's underground. What's interesting is I did research on the North End, and I found the alley where Pickman's, back in the 80s, where Pickman's little studio would have been in, building the room down. The alley is still there. And I went to Cops Hill Burying Ground, where the ghouls were reported, and discovered through research, but also finding an open tomb there, that some of the tombs are false. And during revolutionary or pre-revolutionary times, colonists would build smuggling tunnels to the water. Cops Hill Burying Ground is on a little hill. It's very close to the water, and occasionally you'll find the water side opening of one of these smuggling tunnels, and this is where the ghouls were moving, unsuspected by the people who lived above. And the North End of Boston happens to be the oldest inhabited part of Boston. It was originally the colonials, and then it became, for a long time, it was a black area, and a town area, and then the Delhi area. Now it's more like, general revolution that lives there. Though it still has an Italian flavor, but it's the feeding ground of Lovecraft schools. And of course, as some of you know, Lovecraft visited Richard Pickman in Dream Quest of the Unknown Creator, where he seemed to revisit a lot of things in a kind of a dreamlike, catch as catch can kind of way. And in the dreamland, when the narrator, Carter, why do you not remember those names? No, of course it's the Dream Quest. I don't know if Randolph Carter was in the story too. During his journey, Randolph Carter comes upon Richard Pickman, and he's basically a ghoul now, and he's cavorting with ghouls. But these ghouls aren't even talking. You know how to meet and gibber and whatever, and communicate with them, and they help him move from here to there until he meets Nyarlathotep, who was attended by a character named Yogash the Black, who seems to be the same as Yogash the Ghoul, and one of Lovecraft's fanciful genealogies of Yogash and Smith. Yogash the Ghoul in the genealogy was a descendant of Cthulhu, which seems a little weird since Cthulhu is a non-terrestrial, non-physical being, and Yogash the Ghoul is only a ghoul. He's a super. I don't know. When I was first made aware that I was on this panel, I asked myself, do I know enough about ghouls? And I almost begged off, until a memory came back after 2 weeks. I write about this subject once. And happily, there are well-known bibliographies on the market that people have taken upon themselves to do, and I looked up my list of articles, and I saw Lovecraft schools published in Cryptic Cthulhu in 1983. And I said, I
Don't let the mask slip, Will.
Yeah.
How does he know so much about it?
So I fortunately was able to dig up a copy and I reread it with great amazement. I didn't know I knew this much about ghouls, Lovecraftian ghouls. And one of the things I came up with, which I may have been the first to do, is since the first ghouls in Lovecraft were not Arabian, but Egyptian, it got me thinking, is there some Egyptian connection to Lovecraft's ghouls? And then I hit upon Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death. And in Egyptian culture, the jackal liked to prowl, tombs. That's where they would be most seen. And the dog and the jackal are both canines. And I realized that what Lovecraft may have done with his ghouls in part by, because of the clue of the Egyptian ghouls, was somehow they were connected to Anubis, even though in subsequent stories they seem more connected to Nyarlathotep, but not quite as directly as we might like to have a complete understanding of it. So I think the ghouls are kind of Anubis, spawn, just as there are Cthulhu spawn. And Lovecraft did not do much with the ghouls beyond Hickman's model, The Outsider, and Dream Quest, but he certainly, during the 1920s, they were pretty central to his concept of, creatures that were interesting to write about that he could make sort of his own. I hadn't known until you said it, that was where it came from.
They're not explicitly came out, but it's in the book. The description is they have a head like a cat. So, but they have the scalp of a dog. So
okay.
Whatever that means, it's messed up.
I find it interesting that they're rubbery like the night gods.
Yeah, I think that's just a go-to Lovecraft hat.
That might be.
Oscar, do you think you've got a couple of minutes on Ghoul and gaming, starting with D&D Ghoul?
D&D Ghoul.
Yeah.
D&D Ghoul is not too dissimilar than the Call of Duty Ghoul. There's different interpretations for the Ghoul in gaming. There's the school of thought that the Ghoul is an undead creature that eats the dead, very similar to Romero. There's the school of thought that the Ghoul is a de-evolution, a corruption of somebody who is obsessed with the dead. That was postulated through the cult of ghouls, in fiction and RPG material. The cult in France that they met in the catacombs. They had orgies. They practiced cannibalism. They practiced necrophilia, and they had their handbook, their blasphemous clubhouse handbook of their rules, their charter, which was the cult of ghouls. Put down. The cult was put down by the Vatican, but those cultists are said to have devolved into ghouls. And then there's a school of thought that the ghoul is a natural creature evolving alongside of man, filling that niche to live off of our dead bodies. And then there's Venn diagram circles between all three of those, that ghouls are natural creatures that can also be corrupted humans, that can marry normal human ghouls and have half-ghouls children that become ghouls. It becomes very complicated and a lot of fun as a game designer for building narratives. Because the ghoul in gaming, it's one of those creatures that has to be near humanity to survive. They're not out there in the wastes that you've got to go looking for trouble. They're going to be anywhere human body is buried. So they're going to be following nomads. They're going to be living under cities, under towns. You can encounter a ghoul just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But again, there are different schools of thought. Do ghouls kill and eat humans? Do ghouls not want to kill and eat live humans? Do they want naturally dead flesh that has decayed? Are they an enemy of man? Are they a friend of man? If they're killing living people, they're cutting down the number of corpses that will be born. Because one living human could have like 10 babies and they're all going to die anyway until you get more food. Or are they killing humans because they're hungry and they'll eventually, when you kill a human, it's dead and then you eat the dead body. So there's every game author and designer is going to have their slightly different twist. But it's a very fun creature to write about because it's like a great condiment. It goes well on every kind of story. The ghoul as a villain, the ghoul as a sympathetic character. Again, in many of these ghouls interpretations, ghouls can speak. Ghouls can communicate with humans. They can make pacts. They can try and corrupt you into their pacts to increase their numbers. They can marry you into you. Mixed bloods. It's just an all-around prisoners, and every once in a while they drop them a corpse, and then they watch the pattern of their feeding to predict the future. Because the Romans,
Goulemancy.
yeah, the Romans have we're going to watch the way these chickens eat grain to predict the future. This cult, we're going to drop a corpse into this pit of starving ghouls and watch the way they eat so we can predict the future. It's like eggs. You can do ghouls 100 different ways and it's always going to be good.
So let's talk a little bit about definitions. People who've been listening to panels with me know that I'm not a big fan of bright line definitions that I define from the beginning or from the middle. So you take the things everyone agrees on about ghouls, and that's ghouls, and then it doesn't matter where you draw the line because you can draw it anyway. But let's talk about lines and boundaries. I'd like to get everyone's take on what you think is sort of the core feature of ghoulness, the characteristics of the ghoul. Is it grapes? Is it necrophagy? Is it the canine features? Is it having changelings? Where does the line exist, or should it exist, between Romero zombie and the Renfield and the Chud and the Ed Gein, cannibal killer? All of those are clearly connected to ghoulness somehow, and certainly Vampire's sidekick Renfields are called ghouls in about half of vampire literature. And do we need to stop for that synonym, or is that part of the ghoulosity? What do people think?
I will say that to me, a ghoul is something that gravitates towards anything that's dead, whether it's a necropolis or a tomb or a pile of corpses. I assume if we have a battlefield situation where a lot of corpses lying around, that ghouls might come out to feed. So it's basically anywhere that is a locus point for rotting corpses, or corpses are rotting, a radiant putrefaction. So to me, it's the deadness, the fact that they exist in the ecology, if you can call it that, of the Lovecraftian world, or the greater horror world, is they're like the flies that consume whatever lay their eggs, and these are the eaters of the dead. And to me, that's their core. And everything else, like the canine stuff, that was an accretion at a later time that they acquired from writers who liked to go in that direction. But also that comes from, to me, the Anubis kind of thing, that a jackal is a feaster of corpses, and therefore they represent a final resolution to the problem of the dead body.
I have to agree partially with some and build on that. I think that a fascination and dependence and connection with the dead, for me, is absolutely necessary for a ghoul, for that definition of ghoul. Whether you're a human being who's obsessed with the dead in a very unhealthy way, either eating or copulating or whatever, even just propping them up in the table, propping mom up in a chair upstairs.
So Norman Bates.
For me, Norman Bates is a ghoul. It could be that natural creature waiting, to get into the graveyard. It could be Renfield, because Renfield is fascinated by the dead. Dracula is dead. He is a servant of the dead. And let's say he doesn't die. Let's say Renfield, moves on. Is Dracula going to make this guy a vampire? No, he's worthless. Is this guy going to evolve into something less than human? I would say so. I would say that Renfield is a budding ghoul of that school of thought of corruption and transformation, which is something essentially not human.
Right. So when they take Renfield's body out of the asylum, they throw him wherever, and he sits up. 3 days later, he's like, I'm so hungry.
He'll be clawing, Renfield would be clawing his way out of that coffin and finding a bunch of other ghouls.
Free sequel idea.
Right. Are Romero's zombies ghouls? An argument could be made. I would be on the other side of that argument, because while it is a corruption, it's almost like a viral corruption or a curse. If you're going to get to the zombie mythology,
And also famously, they eat the living.
And they eat the living, they're not eating each other. And I'm of the school of thought that ghouls are not undead. They are living creatures. That's again my favorite interpretation. I guess that's what we're really talking about, our interpretation.
Well, yeah, I mean, we sadly don't have Samuel Henley here to annotate authoritatively what ghouls are. Daniel, you're our Samuel Henley. Annotate authoritatively what ghouls are.
Okay, well,
Wrong.
I'm gonna go with the folkloric answer. The key defining trait of ghouls is shapeshifting, because that's simultaneously correct and completely wrong for this panel.
Well,
All of my questions were about that, because I love Fae folklore too, and like, we'll have very.
I should also point out that this is a motif that does come back. I think it was Brian McDonald's, the late Brian McDonald's Florida Bones that brought this back. The idea of like both the ghouls as shapeshifters, but they can take on the forms of the people they eat. So, so now you I think they get memories too.
Yeah.
Did
So yeah, that's it. Well, I'm gonna
Sat that shit out.
don't worry about this stuff.
Ah!
But you can steal it too. You can steal it from them. It's steal whatever you want.
yeah, McNaughton's Throne of the Bones, obviously, probably the post-Lovecraftian classic ghoul fantasy novel. I would throw out Caitlin Kiernan's Ghoul Cycle, basically. I forget the name, one of them's the Red Tree, but she's got, I think,
Daughter of Hounds.
Daughter of Hounds.
Yeah.
There's a number of novels and short stories. They're all worth reading, and they center on the ecology that we've talked about, but also the social ecology. The people who grow up into this sort of weird family criminal life of robbing the dead's belongings and also feeding them to ghouls and sometimes being recruited or married into the ghoul lineages. And there's a sort of a sympathy for the ghoul in the same way that The Godfather is sympathy for the mob bit to it, and it's terrific. And so I would say, for me, the core element of the ghoul is the interface with humanity in that way, through the lens of the dead, certainly. But
May I be so bold as to throw a question?
sure.
The Adams family. Ghouls are not ghouls.
I would say strong case can be made. We do not ever see them canonically eat a dead person.
You
But,
see them digging them up.
yes, exactly. But, lots of people dig up dead people. But obviously, something keeps Morticia's skin so pearly and beautiful and white. I think eating the dead could be a drinking the shake building. She just ate Angelica Houston, and that was it. Yeah, so again, I threw that out mostly to talk about the fact that the ghoul is plastic, it shapeshifts, as Dan says, and so we can take Norman Bates as a ghoul, we can take Romero zombies as ghouls if we want, and Norman Bates, of course, is a fictionalization of Ed Gein, who is a legitimate example of a human ghoul in the sense of someone who is obsessed with death and focused on it perhaps to the exclusion of everything else. I guess this is where you put a footnote and say that the Werewolf of Paris, the novel by Guy Endor, is actually about a ghoul, so take that, werewolves. And that also might be where Lovecraft gets the notion of a canine ghoul from, because if he's read Werewolf of Paris, he thinks, well, that's just a ghoul, but he's a werewolf. In his subconscious might have been turning that over along with the jackal and along with the notes of Hamlet. Let's see. I feel like I had a lovely question about George Russell's theory that the ghoul changeling is a central motif in Lovecraft, but I think Will Murray basically already answered that question, and no one else is going to do as well, so I'll spare us all the embarrassment and say, what's your favorite incarnation of the ghoul, like specifically? What's your favorite ghoul story or scenario or campaign book, or give us a recommended reading list, a couple of titles or one title, everybody.
Well, Hickman's Marvel.
Well, yeah. I meant besides that.
Yeah, I don't know that I read much besides that I would call a ghoul story. I mean, I read, actually now that I think of it, Robert Johnson's Far Below, which is a famous Wakefield story, that was about ghouls inhabiting subway tunnels. I don't remember it clearly enough to very popular at the time, much reprinted in decades.
And it's superb, it's well worth looking down.
And, you know, he took, I imagine he took the Lovecraftian idea of their under our cities and brought it to another level by having it, you know, essentially feed off of subway riders
I mean, it's literally a riff on the painting subway accident from Pickman's model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And
So that's my favorite non-Lovecraftian Ghouls.
That's from 1939, Robert Johnson.
Could you repeat that title?
Far below.
Farther below?
Far below.
Below.
Robert
Johnson. We're not going to do this for all the authors. You guys have just got to be better at keeping that. Oscar, what do you got?
I'm going to ask for help from the audience because I can't remember the scenario. It's a classic Call of Duty scenario where I guess they're cleaning out some old guy's house. What? Paper chase. Thank you. I was looking on my phone, desperate, right? Paper, and basically they're going through this old man's book collection to catalog it and get rid of it, and he keeps kind of creeping back in when nobody's around, and like, hey, I'm not selling these books. And the guy is one of those humans who's not really dead, or like I said with Renfield, they buried him and he just clawed his way back out. And he doesn't want people going through his stuff. So I think that's a fun intro to Lovecraft rules for Call of Cthulhu. There's a lot of good Call of Cthulhu rule scenarios out there, but that's a classic.
I'm trying to find who wrote it, but
I couldn't even remember the name. I was like desperate.
well, anyway, when you do, give the designer some one.
Okay.
For my part, let's see, probably Caitlin Kiernan, Thorn of Bones, we already talked about, though I think that one is out of print has been for quite some time.
Yeah,
So it's
I thought I saw a copy of the order, but it might be gone now.
And also, The Charnel God by Clark Ashton Smith, which is sort of has been, it's a Zothic tale, which has been sort of appropriated by those authors who are just like, well, we don't want to set something Zothic, but we like more Digian, this idea of this corpse god. That sounds like we bring that, Hite.
Let's see. I think we have to mention the Peter Cushing. Was it Peter Cushing movie, The Ghoul? Hammer? Or Hammer, one of those?
That's right.
Yes. And it's once more, this is the Orientalist Ghoul. This is the, well, he spent time in India. Obviously, his son's going to be a ghoul. That just happens. But it's a fairly effective movie. It's called Ghoul. Who doesn't love that? And it features some pretty good acting, and it gives you sort of flavor and flair for that. I also want to mention what's the Gene Wolfe story? Is it War of the Lamb? There's a Gene Wolfe Ghoul story that has an explicitly Egyptian connection. And I want to say it's War of the Lamb, but in fact, it's so important.
When I look it up, I'll just throw it out. Author of Paper Chase is John Sullivan, and amazingly enough, it has recently been redone by Mike Mason and appears in the Call of Cthulhu starter set. So you're probably going to get the cleaned up on steroids 7th edition version. I didn't even know there was a 7th edition version of Paper Chase. Now I'm going to go pick this up. Definitely quintessential Ghoul scenario for the RPG.
Yeah, it is War of the Lamb. It is by Gene Wolfe. It's an Egyptian origin for the Ghoul, but it's worse than what you think. It ties into Gene Wolfe's version of Amumet, the Eater of the Dead, who is half hippo, half crocodile, half jackal. Amumet is everything the Egyptians knew that ate you, blended into one very unpleasant god. He's who you get turned over to if your heart weighs more than a feather, because you're foreseen. But it's Gene Wolfe, so it is transcendent just by itself, and I definitely recommend it. Harder to work into a game, I feel, than Caitlin Kiernan, who is doing this whole story ecology, but certainly worth looking at for inspiration. That is all of my prepared questions, so I feel like it is now time for unprepared questions. And who better to be unprepared and ask questions than you wonderful people? Yeah.
First of all, thank you for mentioning driving down. I spoke with you and any more detail on your experience with that. I'd be interested also kind of tangential to that. I'd love to hear what you think about the Ghoul as a transgressive source of humor in role-playing. That's kind of, I don't know if I'm the only one who sees that way. I can't believe that's the case of this Brian.
They spend all that time laughing. So.
Also, what does a beep sound like? Does it sound like beaver for the Muppets, or is it something different?
It's creepier.
I recently heard a recording of a baby hyena. Find that and you'll realize what meeping is. And that laughing, the meeping sounds. That I think it's basically playing on hyenas, which are the ultimate ears of death. I've actually thought about this. Not proud of that, but it's kind of what.
Does anyone have any thoughts on the dark comedy or transgressive comedy of the Ghoul? Is that the question?
Well, I just happened to be glancing at this printout from Dream Quest, and Randolph Carter is talking about how his Spanish friend Richard Pickman once introduced him to a rule, and he knew well that canine faces and slumping forms and unmentionable idiosyncrasies. I wonder what those canines like to lick themselves in different places. Could ghouls, could Lovecraft be sliding?
Given Lovecraft's disdain for dogs,
Yeah.
you can just imagine.
Well, there is sort of this element of humor that's just built into the Ghoul. I think that in Pickman's model, you actually have a painting of ghouls laughing at a guidebook about various objects being buried out in the cemetery. So you've already got. Aside from like the what is it, the Star Vampire, creature from Block Rating, you don't get too many creatures in Lovecraft that laugh.
There's also, you just reminded me, there's also, in his workshop, there's a painting of a ghoul posing with a corpse, like holding it up, almost like dancing or propping it up as other ghouls can. Well, so I guess there's joyous, there's some feeding.
And that just kind of lets you do all sorts of things with it. So you've now got these creatures that are kind of human, not human, clearly got a sense of humor.
And some interpretations were human,
Yeah.
so.
A scene in an unknown vault, where scores of the beasts crowded around one who held a well-known Boston guidebook and was evidently reading aloud. All were pointing to a certain passage, and every face seemed so distorted with epileptic and reverberant laughter that I almost thought I heard the fiendish echoes. The title of the picture was Holmes, Lowell, and Longfellow lie buried in Mount Auburn, which, I mean, if Lovecraft literally does it, is it still transgressive to say the Ghoul is funny? I feel like one of the reasons that you can get away with a funny Ghoul in a way that you can't a funny Byakhee is that human connection that we've been talking about. The Ghouls partake of humanity either solely nutritionally or personally as well. And I feel like that connection to humanity means they can laugh and they can have a sense of humor. Dracula's kind of a stiff, but there are vampires that crack wise. Certainly Buffy is full of them. But the Ghoul, I think again because of that hyena connection, the laughing is baked into the core of it. I don't know if it's as core as necrophagy, but I think if you hear something laughing in a graveyard, odds are it's going to be a Ghoul. It's not just.
It's not going to be you.
Not going to be Igor, who just thought of something hilarious that happened back at the castle.
According to Randolph Carter, ghouls also gibber.
Yes.
And in 1930s, if not 1920s, Pulp Fiction, gibbering was something insane people did, or creatures did. I don't know if it came from Lovecraft necessarily. And I assume apes gibbered too, because I think that's an ape sound. But they meet and they gibbered and they laughed. And they could communicate, but they apparently communicated by meeting more than gibbering.
Who doesn't? Do we have another question? Yeah, you have The question is about ghouls and vampires, and where did the vampire's assistant ghoul, or servant ghoul, or slave ghoul come from? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I, for my sins, know a great deal about vampire ghouls, but all right. Fundamentally, you have a structural problem with vampires, which is that they can't run around and do stuff by day. Dracula can, of course, but Dracula's special. And so the vampire sidekick has been named a ghoul going back, I think, it's after Dracula, but it's early enough in the 20th century. Pardon me? Well, yes, Vampire the Masquerade, but it predates Vampire the Masquerade, trust me. And so I believe that is a parallel evolution of the concept of ghoul as someone who is obsessed with death, which is a term, a drift of the word ghoul from, the ghoul the monster is the first use of the word ghoul, because that comes out of Arabian folklore. And then ghoulish, the adjective, which is someone who's like a ghoul, and then someone who's super ghoulish is called a ghoul, even if they're not actually a monster. They are just obsessed with death. And the notion that the vampire sidekick would necessarily be, super thanatophilic, drove people to call them ghouls. I don't think that when Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough describes Saint Germain's servant Roger as a ghoul, that she, for a second, thought about Lovecraft. I think she's working from an earlier tradition of vampires who have sidekicks that do all the daytime domestic stuff. And Roger the Ghoul, I believe, does eat dead people, but he does it in a very decorous, civilized way because he's Saint Germain's sidekick.
So the human ghoul isn't necessarily always obsessed with death, sometimes they just traffic corpses.
Yeah, right.
So that's not, you can call it an obsession, there's other ways to make a living, but really they're profiting off of the availability of corpses that they were able to come up and sell them.
Ghoul is a synonym for body snatcher.
Yeah.
Again, goes, I think, back to the 19th century, if not before. Like Jack Sprat and his wife. Yeah.
So, since you have on the topic of sort of, how do you, mostly from an RPG perspective, distinguish between ghouls and ghasts?
Oscar?
Ghouls are my interpretation, because again, none of these creatures are real. Ghouls are creatures that live near corpses. These are creatures that have very close ties to humans. They could have been human. They intermingled. They could have evolved from humans. Ghasts are a separate offshoot race. In the mythology, they mostly live in dreamlands. They're not really in the waking world too much. These are almost, you could either take it as the purest form of ghouls, and the other ghouls are lesser ghouls, or the highest evolution of a ghoul to a being that is no longer truly tied to humanity. They've kind of ascended past that, or descended from that, depending on how you want to look at it. If humans were ghasts, chimpanzees would be ghouls. There's a connection, there's almost a kinship, but they are related, but two distinct things at this point.
I think that to pull it into the etymological or the taxonomical, the gas pool differential is an artifact of Gary Gygax.
Yes.
Gary has goblins and hobgoblins. There's a monster and there's the tougher version of the monster. Right. And when Lovecraft uses the word ghast in Dream Quest of Unknown Death, you don't get a lot of description of the ghast. It's just, there's ghasts over there, basically. There's not a ton of data. But Gygax sees that and says, oh, that's another thing. That will be the name for my hobgoblin of ghouls. And so the connection, I believe, is pretty much entirely artificial through Gygax saying, I need a tougher ghoul. whether or not you can, I mean, ghouls and ghasts both live in the dreamlands, they're both, awful, I'm sure. You can imagine any number of other connections or other differentiations. The ghast as super ghoul is sort of there with us now forever. But you could certainly imagine that a ghast is, a ghoul but more ghost as opposed to a ghoul but more werewolf or mummy or whatever. The ghasts are like a spectral ghoul, and so you pull back your genie ghoul from Arabian folklore. I feel like ghasts are really yours to play with. Knock yourself out. In the back, yeah.
So, hearing all your descriptions of the different ghouls brings to mind Clive Barker's Cabal, particularly the film. City underneath the graveyard, the changeling aspect, the hanging with the dead, even the joviality and stuff. Do you know if Barker spoke specifically about maybe his influence from that, and kind of your thoughts on whether that's a ghoul society?
Anyone have any knowledge on night reading?
No. It would be opinion, but no
Yeah.
real.
I mean, it is absolutely certain that Clive Barker had read Lovecraft before he wrote Night Read. I think that's, pretty clear. Was he thinking, I'm going to blow up the Lovecraftian ghoul? I doubt it, but that's just based on, my impression of Barker and very brief amounts of chat with him, in which he recognizes Lovecraft, but he does not see himself as a Lovecraftian. And so, I think that the parallels are the sort of parallels that a really strong monster leaves and forces creative artists to do. And so if you're writing a vampire novel, whether you are consciously saying, I'm in the tradition of Bram Stoker, you're in the tradition of Bram Stoker. And I feel like the Night Read, because of all the qualities that you just gave, are very much in the tradition of Lovecraft, and that Lovecraft's forcible turning of the ghoul from exotic Persian monster that symbolizes a xenophobic fear of the other to, ghouls are always with us, they're in our own cemeteries and have been since colonial times, and we're probably part ghoul anyway. I mean, for Lovecraft, that is a remarkable thing to have done, is to take a monster and make it less racist.
He realized that he probably would have made correction.
No, he was not a correction guy, he just moved on. Yeah.
While there's no direct connection between the Arabic mythology ghoul and the sort of ghoul that became now, when you look through sort of, worldwide mythology, there does seem to be a connection between this sort of like stranger off in the distance who transforms or evolutions and cannibalism. Is there, even though Lovecraft sort of came up with this not entirely full plot, but through bad translation, do you think there is something inherent in that?
Like, I think the cannibalism is core, or anthropophagy, because they're not people. But man-eating is core to the original Arabic ghoul. It used to be, Richard Burton, in his notes to the Arabian Nights, says that ghoul comes from the Arabic word to seize, and modern Arab etymologists say it comes from the word to kill. So the part where ghouls kill you is pretty much baked into the core, and that they eat you is also assumed similar to the ogre. The eating of the dead is what Lovecraft brings out of Galland and Beckford. So the cannibal monster off in the distance that eats you by the side of the road is universal, because guess what? Leaving your hometown was always super dangerous. Yeah.
So does that make that in the house another Lovecraft ghoul story?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
I would say Cannibal Hillbilly, not cool.
Yeah.
Here's where we can sneak back around to George Wetzel and his great essay, Limithos, in which he explicitly does say a picture in the house is part of the evolving ghoul symbology, that the unnatural extension of life by eating dead people becomes the seemingly immortal outsider, becomes the pygmy ghoul.
Path.
The path. And he traces, of course, back to whatever that is in the tune in Statement of Randolph Carter. And so you have Randolph Carter to The Outsider to, or Randolph Carter to Picture in the House to The Outsider to Pigment. And that becomes this sort of arc as Lovecraft builds this myth, over and over and over in the way that you start by saying, Zeus is the god of thunder, and then you start telling us more stories about it.
Is that an essay or?
Yeah, it's the essay, the Cthulhu Mythos. It's been reprinted a lot in different collections of mythos scholarship. It is remarkably underrated by people. I think it is, it was one of the only attempts to do a simplest reading of Lovecraft ever. There's a new one now, but I think Wetzel, even people who are basically, as I say, building on Wetzel, don't give Wetzel enough. But definitely I recommend it. It's in 4 Decades of Criticism. I think it's in another one of the collections that's maybe easier to get. Any more questions?
Maybe the hound also would Ghoul text, because I mean, it's going in that direction.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah,
I was just thinking that.
Foolishness, and they're considered by monsters.
Yeah, I think I had a Wetzel question about for everybody, but I'm glad Wetzel is coming back to us. I think Wetzel also incorporates the hound into that reading, and certainly the combination of funerary, ornament, graves, and a hound maybe points us in that direction.
But ironically, I think if there are ghouls in that story, it's the two guys digging up corpses, not
Yeah.
the creature that kills them. If anything, the creature that kills them is not a friend of ghouls because it's punishing someone for grave robbery.
Yeah.
If anything, the hound is an anti-ghoul. It's a defender of the dead.
Or it's protecting its food source.
Yeah, there we are.
An argument could be made.
And I will point out that the hound is the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-eating cult of Lang. So, pretty good.
Can you tie that background to the black dog and Irish fairy as well?
I don't know that Lovecraft knew enough about that lore to have been consciously meaning it.
And that actually only pops up in Victorian times. It's not a very old myth. So that's kind of a very neat thing. So it doesn't tie back that far.
Don't we see the Welsh equivalent with the Blue Mountain in the Mandalorian?
Yeah, but a big magic, that's like saying Cerberus left, magic dogs everywhere. The Mabinogion, those are like unique monsters. They're not lessons.
But creatively, you can do all this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tie in these concepts, I think it's interesting to tie, because one thing we see in a lot of cryptozoological discussion these days is about like dog men who just show up places. And there you go, people say those are werewolves, but there's not really a idea of transformation so much with those. So it's like,
Saint Christopher was a dog man.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
want to hear this criticism.
Just like when I pronounced all the Welsh.
No, good for you. You will get a letter from Robert E. Howard demanding your sources, and then you will become best friends. Any other questions? Yeah, way back.
Just a little statement that I thought of.
You're so far back. Can you demask or move forward with it?
Just a little statement that I thought of. Hyenas are casually classed with the conics by most people, but they're actually closer to the feathers. They are literally cat-headed beasts with the scalps of wolves.
Second look at Samuel Henley, everybody.
Excellent.
Any other footnotes or questions? Yeah.
So it's, I don't think any of you explicitly mentioned it, but I believe that all of your quantifications of what is a ghoul, all of them happen to also be humanoid. Do you think that ghouls by nature have to be humanoid, and if so, to what degree?
Should ghouls be humanoid? I think this is everyone gets an answer.
I think in all of the mythology, even as where they're fairy creatures, they're always humanoid, there's always that inherent connection to humanity. If there are no human aspects of a ghoul, then they're just a monster. They're something, they're their own thing, my opinion.
In Dream Quest, Randolph Carter is told to impersonate a ghoul in order to continue his journey. He's told to shave his beard, because ghouls don't have one, and to roll and mold, so that will give him the proper skin texture, and he'd be naked, carry his clothing as a bundle as if he's carrying a corpse. And so basically Randolph Carter as a human being is sufficiently similar to a ghoul. He just needs a little bit of work, you know? So yeah, I think ghouls are basically human.
I think the way that runs through this is ghouls are humans, but, and then you have the asterisk, and then you just do whatever you want with the asterisk. And, you know, maybe they're dog-headed humanoids. They're, people who don't, behave according to society's norms. They can change into, various animals, but it seems to always come back to that, at least in what I've seen.
I feel like part of that is because if you're looking for a dog-headed quadruped that eats people, we have the wolf. And the wolf is such a powerful symbol that if you had a monster that was kind of like a wolf, it's just going to get drunk up in wolf. So you may want to, pick nits of the beast of Gevaudan or whatever, but 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, if you didn't have a humanoid thing that ate people by the side of the road or corpses after Galan, you just have a wolf. Or a hyena, or a jackal, or the dogs that hang around graveyards in, Mesopotamia in the 19th century.
Or a coyote.
Or a coyote, exactly. And I think, didn't McNaughton also do a sort of a coyote story? I feel like he did, maybe it was somebody else. No, it was Niskander that did the coyote sort of mythos with his Sam Muller stuff. Desperately trying to rescue August Derlet's nonsense. Yeah.
So on that humanoid thing, is cannibalism respectful or cruel?
I think eating flesh, yeah, but no, I think eating human flesh, but whether it's a dead person or a live person is the big philosophical argument. Posture. Yeah. I mean, it's somehow scarier if a person-like thing is eating you than if a wolf is eating you.
Right, that's just part of the
This is probably tangential, but in terms of memory, something like Larry David, World Engineer, doesn't he have like a variation where he makes the kings of the ring world and it's the ghouls?
Yeah.
Because they're always there among all the other races. Disposing of the problem.
Yeah, and that I am again 1,000% sure that that's Larry doing a Lovecraft bit.
I was just curious about your take on some of the film interpretations, like The Lurking Fear. If you've seen the film, they very much turn the family into ghouls. Or Hackle's Tale from Masters of Horror, Clive Barker, where she visits the graveyard to copulate with the ghouls, or to copulate with the dead and such. I mean, does that cross into ghoul territory for you? Have you seen any of those?
I haven't seen it.
No?
When you say Lurking Fear, do you mean Dark Heritage?
There's a 1980s movie by Full Moon called Lurking Fear. Yeah, I believe it's based off of that story. I can't remember the correct story.
The only one I can recall seeing is Dark Heritage, which was on the DVD menu, was Drac Heritage. It's so murky, it's hard to say exactly what's going on in that movie.
No, the one I'm talking about has Ashley Lawrence and Jeffrey Combs in it. So I think it's 85, 86 possibly. Might even be a little later. But I was just curious if you'd seen some of the interpretations of ghouls in film.
There's a Night Gallery episode, Hickman's Model.
Yeah.
It's the first episode, yeah.
I've seen the Clive Barker one, and I think Barker is playing with it, but again, I think Barker is so idiosyncratic and so strongly concerned with things Lovecraft was never at all concerned with. That if there's a crossover, it's a crossover that, you know, Oscar or I or whoever can use in a game, but it's not something that you would say, well, this is, again, Barker doing a tribute to Lovecraft. I feel like, yeah, if you want to have a cool sexy time in your, you know, story or your campaign, knock yourself out. I mean, obviously supply your players with X cards, but I think that would be great fun.
Well, Hackle's Tale actually came up specifically because of the story you mentioned about the rice. The woman would eat a piece of rice and then go off to the graveyard at night. And it's almost exactly the same with Hackle's Tale, except he replaces it with sex. That's it. That's really.
Well, again, he's probably riffing on the Arabian Nights.
Right. I saw a connection.
You had one.
Oh, your question's probably more relevant, I was going to start asking as, so back to humor. What is your favorite way to prepare necrotized flesh?
And we have necrotizing flesh recipes to share with the audience.
I think you just let it cool.
Just tartar.
Yeah.
That's a known vector, frankly. Oscar, do you have a necrotized flesh recipe?
No, I'm actively fighting against all of those impulses.
All right. He's gone one of the opposite of keto. It's okay. I mean, I just would say, you know, go with the experts. The Aztecs use pepper and chocolate, so
You can't go wrong with
knock
those.
yourselves out. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.